Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson is the only British politician known universally by a first name. Boris Bikes, Boris the blonde bombshell, Boris the buffoon. Even the Prime Minister knows it. Boris is Boris. When it comes to Mr. Johnson, a surname is optional. But who is the man beneath the hair? Much like President Trump, Britain's Foreign Secretary has acquired a reputation as a maverick. Yet his background places him firmly in the establishment. Son of a diplomat, later turned MEP, Boris was born in New York City. Fittingly, he possessed the multiculturalism embraced by the city with his father's Turkish roots. But it wasn't long before the child who wanted to be king of the world came home and was inducted into a series of elite British institutions. After attending the same primary school as Ed Miliband, he went to Eton and Christ Church College, Oxford. He was union president and part of the notorious Bullingdon Club, with many others seemingly born to rule.
Britain just leapt into the lifeboat, jumped out of the ERM and let the rest, manage as best they could. There was absolutely no attempt to give a kind of lead or unify the community during that time. And I think other countries, particularly the Dutch, felt very strongly about that.
His career as a journalist didn't begin well. He was fired from the Times for making up a quote. Fittingly, his career took off in earnest in Brussels. He was a young and carefree, his critics say careless, journalist for the Telegraph between 1989 and 1994. Nestled in the bosom of the Eurocrats, he filed stories that blazed a trail. He delighted his bosses and his readers, peddling facts and the odd fiction about Europe. Boris's Brussels was the land of straight bananas and prawn cocktail crisp bands. And over 20 years later, he would deploy the very same stories as a weapon of choice in the Brexit battle. But he wasn't content to continue as an onlooker. Politics beckoned. He contested Clwyd South in 1997, but even the blonde bombshell couldn't hold back Tony Blair's New Labour landslide. He lost. Undeterred, he continued to build his profile in newspapers and on British panel shows, perfecting his bumbling blonde persona.
Do you want to
know the honest truth?
What's that?
They produced the jacket before I'd written the book. That's it.
How do they know if it was going to be you who's going to write it?
I must have forgotten what the title was.
By 1999, he took the editorship of The Spectator magazine, promising its owners he would abandon his political ambitions for the time being. In 2001, he was elected the MP for Henley. Socially, he was liberal, voting to repeal Section 28 and supporting the Gender Recognition Act in 2004.
And I have some perfectly respectable neighbours, good bourgeois types who, without giving the game away or naming them, whenever they're sitting in of an evening, got nothing else to do, they roll up a spliff and quietly smoke it together.
Until 2008, he held various shadow ministerial roles under the leadership of Michael Howard and David Cameron. But he was fired by Michael Howard after lying about an affair.
So are you going to save your marriage?
I'm going to do whatever I can to lock me out.
Do you think it's unfair that you've been removed from the front bench?
I think all is for the best and best of all possible worlds. And I wish you a great morning.
Thank you.
An unmissable opportunity loomed: the London mayoralty. A theme was emerging. Boris rather likes to have his cake and eat it too. He managed to woo both traditional Tories and erstwhile Labour supporters of Red Ken Livingstone. Many weren't voting Conservative, they were voting for Boris. Some accused him of taking credit for projects started by his predecessor Ken Livingstone. And London's sponsored bicycle scheme was dubbed Boris Bikes, regardless of the sponsor on the side. He was adamantly pro-EU and even talked of Turkish succession to the Union. Amid the London riots, his response was seen by some as lacklustre and a low point of his time as mayor. It led to heavy criticism on the city's streets.
You're racist, you need to resign!
What about the...
It is time
that...
His plans for Boris Island never got off the ground. Critics say he made London unaffordable and loosened planning laws.
In the way.
You
It
said
wasn't a
they
question
didn't
of-
have the resources,
Well, I
and
don't- by
that's
that I don't
years
mean-
of local government cuts under your
Kathy,
government. That's true though, isn't it?
What? No, they didn't have
You're
the team
denying
in
that there have been
place.
years of local
They
government
didn't
cuts?
have the team in place.
Yet he remained an immensely popular figure. And even getting stuck on a zip wire couldn't spoil his party. As his star rose, so too did new questions over his leadership ambitions. But to become leader, first Boris needed to become an MP once again, which would mean having his cake and eating it. In fact, he denied he would return to Parliament during his mayoral term 17 times in one interview. Months later, he was MP for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and still Mayor of London. When in 2015 David Cameron made the surprise announcement he wouldn't stand for a third term, the door to number 10 appeared to open just a crack.
happen, it is more likely that, as I say, I will be reincarnated as an olive or knocked in a disused fridge or decapitated by a flying frisbee.
But the fact is now, that it's been started now, hasn't it?
But Boris needed to get his foot in. David Cameron had promised to hold a referendum on Britain's membership with the EU. It was to have far-reaching consequences, not least for Boris himself. He agonised over his position and had written drafts of both a Remain and Leave column for the Daily Telegraph. He'd enjoyed the odd cheeky sideswipe at the EU in the past.
Cardiff Council decided to interpret the Animal Byproducts Regulation 2002 in such a way as to forbid people from recycling tea bags. Now that is a classic example, in my view, of the confluence of EU legislation with overzealous British implementation.
That's an action.
But he'd also extolled the benefits of mass immigration. Boris met with his friend, arch-Brexiteer Michael Gove, on the eve of the campaign. They joined forces to launch the Leave campaign.
And it's my view that after 30 years of writing about this, we have a chance actually to do something. I have a chance actually to do something. I would like to see a new relationship based more on trade, on cooperation, but as I say, with much less of this supranational element. So that's where I'm coming from.
It was bloody. The cabinet was split down the middle, and Boris was accused of running a campaign based on half-truths and outright lies. He flipped his position on Turkey joining the EU, warning it would give millions of migrants rights to work in the UK.
This stat that you've got plastered on the side of the bus, the £350 million a week goes to the EU. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says that's a misleading figure. The UK Statistics Authority says that's a misleading figure. Isn't it the case that you're cherry-picking and even manipulating stats to suit you?
What it represents is the global sum that we send to Brussels.
But it doesn't take into account the rebate.
What is unquestionably true is that we write out a cheque for effectively we send £20 billion a year to Brussels, over which we have no control.
He was in his element, travelling the country in his big red bus, waving pasties, clutching British asparagus and kissing English caught fish at Billingsgate Fish Market.
It's probably going to be Leave, I think.
Is it Boris Johnson that swung it?
He had some to do with it, I think, yeah.
A lot of people in Cornwall know the realities of the EU in Cornwall and what we get from it, so I don't think it will change it all that much.
You're an undecided voter then?
I was. Who knows now?
Has he persuaded you?
I think he just might have done.
At 3:25 in the morning, Sheffield declared for Leave. Durham, Birmingham, Northumberland followed. Boris was vindicated, but the country was bitterly divided. His fellow Etonian David Cameron's career was over. Within hours, he'd left Downing Street with his wife and children. The ball had come loose from the back of the scrum. It looked like a two-horse race between quiet Remainer and Home Secretary Theresa May and Boris Johnson, the brash face of the Leave campaign. But Boris had underestimated his campaign mate. In a shock announcement, Michael Gove said he would also run for PM. He didn't believe Boris was up to the job.
Let's have come here.
I have concluded that person cannot be me.
The job slipped from his grasp. Britain's new Prime Minister was not a blonde bombshell, but the first female PM since Margaret Thatcher. Boris appeared vanquished, but only briefly. When Mrs May announced her new cabinet appointments, there was only one that dominated the headlines. Bumbling Boris was to be Foreign Secretary, Britain's representative to the world. Michael Gove was left out in the cold, while Boris was sent around the world, some said as far away from Downing Street as Number 10 could get him.
But you have an unusually long history of wild exaggerations and frankly outright lies that I think few foreign secretaries have prior to this job.
I appreciate the First Amendment in your right to free speech, but I think we need chapter and verse on this stuff. Sorry.
Go ahead. This is what you would do if you were in my place.
I'm sorry. Look, I mean, let me just
Let's go.
Repeat my point, which is that.
Theresa May, meanwhile, was gearing up for the biggest mistake of her premiership. She misread the country and underestimated her opponent, Jeremy Corbyn, by calling an election. The Conservatives lost their majority and Theresa May her authority.
With the door to Number 10 opening a crack again, bumbling Boris has yet again tripped himself up on the doormat.
Well, look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing. It's just, she was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it.
He had to clarify these comments as they were incorrect and could worsen the situation of an Iranian British woman currently held in Tehran.
The UK government has no doubt that she was on holiday in Iran when she was arrested last year, and that was the sole purpose of her visit.
Why won't you apologise properly to Nazanin's family, and are you now willing to meet them?
Well, as I've said repeatedly, and I said in the House of Commons yesterday, I'm very happy to meet the family, and I'm Mr. Ratcliffe. I'm, in fact, I think, very much hoping to see him before I go to Iran in the course of the next few weeks.